Stupidity kills faster than altitude ever does. On Mount Everest, most fatalities don't come from storms or avalanches. They come from ignoring basic rules, misusing gear, and making decisions that should have never required debate. Today, we're breaking down multiple deaths where nothing catastrophic happened except human judgment failing in the death zone. It was May 19th, 2016, on the South Col Road of Mount Everest, at the Geneva Spur traverse around 26,800 feet. The morning was clear but bitterly cold, and the fixed line cut across a slope of blue ice exposed to constant wind. Climbers were stalled by traffic, standing still in an environment where standing still steadily drains the body. Nothing failed all at once. The danger accumulated quietly during the wait. Tomas Ilić was 41, a Serbian civil engineer who spent weekdays managing infrastructure projects and weekends training for endurance events. He approached Everest the same way he approached work, with spreadsheets, schedules, and contingency tables. Teammates respected his discipline, but noticed his fixation on timing. He believed delays were the most dangerous variable on the mountain, something to be minimized at all costs. Ravi Patel was 34, an Indian logistics coordinator on his first 8,000-meter peak. He was fit at lower altitudes, but had limited experience above 7,000 meters. Ravi was optimistic to a fault, trusting that effort and positive thinking could compensate for acclimatization gaps. He carried standard supplemental oxygen and followed a commercial plan, but his preparation at extreme altitude was thin. The traverse backed up as climbers ahead struggled to move efficiently. Ravi arrived late to the line, visibly hypoxic, his movements sloppy and speech slurred. He fumbled with his carabiner and leaned heavily on the rope. Tomas noticed the delay, pushing his schedule past the planned turnaround window. Wind chill dropped temperatures near minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing moisture instantly. Ravi stopped completely, breathing hard, unable to coordinate clipping and unclipping. Tomas weighed the choice quickly. Leaving Ravi there meant further delay and risk to everyone behind. He removed his own regulator and handed it over, intending to help Ravi recover for a minute and keep the line moving. Tomas remained clipped but was now breathing ambient air in the death zone. As Ravi increased his oxygen flow, moisture inside the regulator condensed and froze. The valve iced internally, sealing shut. Oxygen delivery stopped without warning. Ravi's breathing grew frantic as he tugged at the hose, unable to understand why nothing was coming through. Tomas inhaled deeply, expecting relief that never arrived. Tomas dropped to one knee, then tipped sideways onto the icy traverse. His helmet struck the slope, and he lay still, his body starved of oxygen. Ravi, panicking and nearly blind from hypoxia, stepped over him. His boots skidded on polished ice. The jamar on his line failed to recede as he loaded it unevenly. Ravi slid, accelerated, struck the slope once, and vanished over the edge below the fixed line. Moments later, Tomas attempted to recover, reaching weakly for the rope. His tether failed to hold on the icy sheath. He was pulled from the traverse and fell after Ravi, out of sight. Climbers above called the incident immediately over the radio. No rescue was possible at that altitude and location. Both men fell hundreds of feet. Recovery was delayed by the weather and traffic. The post-mortem examination concluded that both deaths began with acute hypoxia, followed by massive blunt force trauma. Ravi's regulator was recovered later, the valve frozen shut with zero airflow. Tomas showed no evidence of supplemental oxygen use at the time of his fall. Tomas's planning documents circulated quietly among teammates afterward as an example of schedule pressure overriding judgment. Ravi's family received the recovered regulator months later, and the internal ice was still locking the valve in place. It was May 16th, 2014, at the Hillary Step on Mount Everest, roughly 28,900 feet above sea level. Camp 4 departures had been delayed overnight, compressing climbers into a narrow summit window. Wind was moderate, visibility was clear, and the fixed lines were already crowded. The mountain was not hostile that morning. It was simply unforgiving of small mistakes. Miguel Arroyo was 39, a warehouse supervisor from Puebla, Mexico, accustomed to long shifts and physical work. He trained hard, trusted his strength, and believed endurance could bridge gaps in experience. His expedition was budget constrained, relying on rented equipment secured days before the climb. New high-altitude boots were fitted quickly, adequate on paper, unfamiliar in reality. Kenji Sato was 52, a Japanese hobby climber who approached Everest methodically. He kept detailed journals, followed checklists, and moved deliberately on fixed lines. Kenji had summited lower peaks over decades and accepted slow progress as safety. He was clipped directly behind Miguel that day, maintaining minimal spacing to keep the line moving. The Hillary step had become a choke point as climbers queued to ascend and descend. Miguel felt the delay, cutting into his turnaround margin, and rushed final adjustments. He tightened one boot fully. The other was left marginal, snug enough to walk, but not locked for lateral loading. No one stopped him. Time pressure overruled rechecking. As the line inched forward, Miguel stepped high onto a rock edge, glazed with old ice. The move required sideways pressure. His loose boot twisted. The ankle snapped outward with a crack heard by climbers above and below. Miguel screamed and collapsed backward, slamming into the rope. Kenji was clipped close and was yanked forward. Instantly, Miguel flailed, loading the fixed line violently. The rope jerked. Kenji's carabiner rotated under shock, cross-loaded against the rock. The gate failed. Both men lost attachment simultaneously. They tumbled together down the south face, bodies striking rock steps in rapid succession. Helmets shattered. Packs tore free. Within seconds, they disappeared from view, falling hundreds of feet. Climbers above shouted and called on radios. No rescue was possible from that position. Later examination found Miguel suffered an open ankle fracture before the fall, followed by massive blunt force injuries incompatible with life. Kenji sustained immediate cervical spine transection on the first major impact. Rope fibers and carabiner deformation were consistent with extreme shock loading beyond design limits. The incident was logged as a fatal fall involving equipment misuse under congestion. The rental shop later revised boot-fitting policies and required extended testing before issuance. Kenji's journal was recovered from his pack, the final entry reading, "Check boots twice." Recovery was delayed by traffic and altitude, and both bodies were located days later below the route. Weather windows limited movement, and teams documented the scene before descent. The fixed line was replaced, and spacing rules were reiterated during subsequent summit pushes. The loss reinforced how congestion amplifies minor errors into shared consequences. Investigators noted no manufacturing defects in the rope or hardware. The sequence matched eyewitness accounts and standard failure modes. Climbers behind were instructed to descend immediately. Operations resumed later with stricter turnaround enforcement and mandatory gear checks at Camp 4. Guides briefed clients on spacing, communication, and rechecking boots at every stop. The summit window closed soon after. The mountain remained unchanged, but the margin for error was shown to be thinner than schedules allowed. Both families were notified through their expedition operators, and personal effects were returned during the following season after recovery efforts concluded under clear documentation and chain of custody procedures observed strictly. It was May 23, 2018, above the balcony on Mount Everest at roughly 27,500 feet. The route was quiet in the early hours, the wind steady and dry, the sky clear enough to suggest safety. Climbers moved deliberately along the fixed line, aware that small inefficiencies at this height compound quickly. Nothing looked wrong. The failure was already underway. Daniel Moore was 45, an IT contractor from Manchester who spent most of the year traveling between short-term projects. He was disciplined, methodical, and physically fit, a runner who tracked metrics obsessively at sea level. On the mountain, he trusted routine and self-control. His expedition was self-funded, with no sponsors, and he took pride in not needing special treatment or extra support. Daniel prepared thoroughly in some areas and neglected others. He trained in cardiovascular endurance extensively, but underestimated cold weather hydration. He carried melted snow in a thin plastic bottle, tucked into his pack, uninsulated and exposed. At altitude, fluid intake is critical to maintain blood volume and oxygen delivery. Frozen water removes that margin quietly, without pain or immediate warning. During the ascent toward the balcony, wind chill dropped temperatures well below zero. The bottle froze solid within hours. Daniel stopped drinking long before the summit push, assuming he could push through mild thirst. Dehydration thickened his blood, worsening hypoxia and slowing his brain. His pace fell slightly. His movements grew less precise. No alarm sounded. Above the balcony, the slope steepened and the air thinned further. Daniel's breathing felt labored, each step heavier than the last. His oxygen mask felt restrictive. Judgment dulled by hypoxia and dehydration led him to misinterpret the sensation. He believed he was not getting air. He reached up and removed the mask. Without supplemental oxygen, his saturation dropped rapidly. He staggered, missing a step beside the fixed line, and fell forward into drifted snow. His face struck first. He did not attempt to arrest himself. The collapse was sudden and complete. Daniel lay prone, unconscious within seconds. Snow packed around his mouth and nose as wind drifted loose powder over his face. With no mask and no movement, his airway became obstructed. There was no visible struggle. Climbers behind him noticed him only after he failed to move. A climber called out and radioed for help immediately. Others reached him within minutes, but could not safely reposition him without risking themselves. At that altitude, intervention options were limited. Oxygen was reapplied, but there was no response. He remained motionless as the wind continued to blow snow across his face. Rescue personnel were notified, but response time at that location exceeded an hour. By the time a team could safely approach, Daniel had been unresponsive for too long. He was pronounced dead on the route, secured to prevent further movement. The post-mortem examination later identified hypoxic collapse followed by asphyxiation due to airway obstruction. Snow and ice were found compacted in the nasal passages and mouth. Facial abrasions were consistent with a forward fall. There was no evidence of defensive movement after the collapse. No equipment malfunction was identified. His oxygen system was functional, and his mask showed no defects. The smartwatch recovered from his wrist recorded steady movement, followed by an abrupt stop. After the expedition, Daniel's family shared his smartwatch data with investigators. The hydration log showed fluid intake ceasing hours before the incident. The graph circulated quietly on UK climbing forums, posted without commentary. The danger wasn't dramatic. It was an empty thermos. It was May 21st, 2015, on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest, just below the Hillary Step. The morning was cold and clear, with steady wind and a slow line of climbers edging upward. Radios crackled intermittently, but otherwise the ridge was quiet. The route looked stable, yet it relied on constant tension, attention, and shared awareness to remain safe. Lucas Benitez was 29, an Argentine audio technician who spent his career managing live sound for touring bands. He was known for staying calm when equipment failed and crowds pressed in. Training runs and long climbs were always done with music, a habit he believed kept his breathing even and his mind steady. His expedition was modest and self-funded, with no sponsors, only encouragement from co-workers who followed his progress online. Lucas understood technical systems. He respected gear and processes, but he trusted routine deeply. On Everest, the southeast ridge is a narrow spine of snow and rock protected by fixed lines. Movement depends on climbers staying clipped, spacing themselves, and responding instantly to changes ahead. At extreme altitude, delays in reaction can be fatal, even when conditions appear controlled. Summit traffic was heavy that morning. Above Camp 4, guides had warned teams to expect congestion near the Hillary Step. Lucas chose to keep his earbuds in, music low but constant, believing it helped regulate his pace. He ignored the suggestion to remove them in crowded sections. He stayed clipped in and advanced when the line moved. Several climbers ahead were negotiating a short rock step. One slipped briefly, unloading the rope before regaining footing. Shouts went up as a warning, but the wind carried sound unevenly. Lucas did not hear them. The fixed line slackened suddenly, then shifted. Seeing movement ahead, Lucas stepped forward. His weight transferred as the rope dropped away from tension. His front boot met empty air where the line had been supporting balance. He pitched forward instantly, momentum carrying him headfirst down the slope. His helmet struck a rock lip, forcing his neck backward beyond its limit. The cervical spine failed at the upper vertebrae. His body continued to tumble, striking snow and stone before sliding to a stop several meters below the line. The fall was violent but brief. Climbers above froze, then radioed for help. One guide descended carefully within minutes, reaching Lucas and attempting an assessment. There was no response, no voluntary movement, and no breathing pattern consistent with life. Earbuds were still seated, music audible in the thin air. Rescue teams were notified immediately, but response at that altitude was limited. It took approximately 40 minutes for additional climbers to secure the area and reach him safely. By then, it was clear there was nothing to be done. Lucas was secured to the line to prevent further sliding. The medical assessment later described a high cervical spine fracture with complete spinal cord transection. The injury would have caused instant paralysis and loss of breathing. Death occurred within seconds of impact. There were no signs of prolonged suffering. No equipment failure was found. The The rope, anchors, and carabiners were intact. The incident resulted from a momentary loss of situational awareness during congestion. After the expedition, Lucas's employer posted a short memorial urging climbers to remove headphones above Camp 4. The message was shared widely among mountaineers. It traveled faster than any official advisory. Authorities recorded the death as accidental and closed the route temporarily. Team leaders reviewed communication protocols and spacing rules. No citations were issued. The mountain returned to routine traffic within days after standard internal safety reviews. It was May 17, 2013, near the south summit of Mount Everest. A narrow ridge carried a fragile cornice outward into space, shaped by days of wind and new snow. Climbers moved cautiously, aware that the ridge held weight only when treated gently. The danger was not hidden. It waited for attention to drift. Ethan Brooks was 36, a freelance videographer who made his living selling dramatic outdoor footage. He chased moments that felt earned, believing proximity created truth. Sponsors were informal, small production houses and expedition operators who promised exposure rather than protection. He was skilled with cameras and calm under pressure, but framing often replaced caution. Oleg Kuznetsov was 44, a Russian climber on his final push. He moved slowly, clearly exhausted, his steps heavy and uneven. At this altitude, the ridge demands constant balance. Cornices form when wind deposits snow beyond solid ground, creating an unsupported shelf that can break without warning. Traffic was compressed near the south summit. Ethan stopped to film Oleg struggling, speaking softly as the camera rolled. He wanted the contrast between effort and exposure. Oleg paused, breathing hard, leaning on his axe. Guides ahead had warned about soft edges, but the moment felt controlled. Ethan backed up for a wider angle, eyes fixed on the viewfinder. His heel pressed into the cornice. The snow fractured cleanly. There was no sag, only a sudden release. The overhang collapsed, taking both men with it. They dropped together, bodies briefly suspended before the slope pulled them down. The falling mass triggered a small slab that carried them faster, tumbling and striking rock beneath the snow. Within seconds, they disappeared from view. Climbers above shouted and radioed for help. A call went out immediately. No one could descend safely onto the broken slope. Wind filled the air with drifting snow. Rescue teams reached the area hours later, but the slide path was silent. Recovering weeks later, both men had extensive blunt force injuries. Bones were broken throughout, and internal organs were destroyed. Death occurred during the fall, not afterward. The camera was recovered intact. Its final file contained shaking footage and wind noise, ending abruptly. The incident was logged as a fatal cornice collapse. No equipment failure was identified. The footage was archived by the expedition company. It was never released. Investigators noted the cornice line extended beyond the rock's spine, unsupported by ice. Weather records showed recent loading from crosswinds. The sequence matched eyewitness accounts and terrain evidence. No violations were cited, as filming had not breached any explicit rule. After the season, expedition briefings changed. Camera use was restricted on exposed ridges. Ethan's final project credit was removed. Oleg's name was added to the year's memorial list. The mountain kept its schedule, and teams returned when the window reopened. Lessons were shared quietly, without clips or commentary. Family notifications followed standard protocol. Effects were cataloged and returned later. Insurance claims closed the case administratively. No further action was recommended. Guides reiterated spacing, awareness, and cornice avoidance in subsequent briefings. The ridge remained exposed to the same forces. Conditions are repeated yearly. Attention determined outcomes. The loss entered statistics, not headlines. A reminder carried in training notes and margins. Records listed time, location, and cause. Names were logged and dates filed. No anomalies remained. Operations resumed per plan, and traffic normalized. Silence returned to the ridge, shaped again by wind and snow. Alone. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.